I'm not sure what it was about photography because right from a very early age, I used to remember closing my eyes. I'd see a scene, and I'd shut my eyes, slam my eyes shut, and try to see the picture in my head. And I often would. I'd be able to trap it there for a short time. And I remember thinking it would be nice if I could just keep that image. And I know painters often talk about that, of being able to slam their eyes shut and remember something and then later on paint it. And my father, who was a painter, as an artist, not a house painter, he did photography later in his life, and I used to admire his cameras when I was a kid, perhaps 12 years old. He had a Helena, which was a Hong Kong-made Rolleiflex, and I used to love looking at the photos that he'd shoot on that camera. And you know, I can remember looking at magazines like Time Life magazine and those sorts, and I used to really enjoy looking at the pictures, and I'd try to imagine those pictures. But photography really then was just something people did as snapshots, as family snapshots. I never realised really that's what they were doing. That's what these great life photographers were doing. We're just basically using cameras. It doesn't matter how flash the camera is. And they were recording the world. And I guess that was the early thing. My uncle gave me a darkroom. He was an Air Force pilot during the Second World War, and he gave me an enlarger and some trays and a developing tank. And at the back of the house in Seatoun, where we lived, Seatoun in Wellington, I set up a darkroom, and I figured it all out for myself. And my camera, called an Ica, which I thought was a Leica, but it wasn't. It was called an Ica, IKA, which is a folding camera at the time, which I picked up somewhere really cheaply. And I figured out how to develop the films, and actually at one point when I was probably about 13 or 14, I used to develop and print the neighbours' photos, and I figured I could do it cheaper than the chemist shop. And I'd be sweating over individual prints for hours and hours, and you know, they would get those prints for probably equivalent to sixpence, so there's certainly no money in it. And but it was all learning the basics of photography.
Formal training?
No formal training at all, nothing at all. I remember a lady next door called Mrs. Richmond, and she was from the Richmond family, a famous family in Wellington. And her husband, if you go to New Plymouth, you can find the Richmond Cottage. They were a family of pioneers in New Zealand, and she was at the time probably in her 70s or 80s. She was this hideously old lady next door who had a fascinating face. And I remember taking my father's Helena next door and putting it on a tripod, and I've still got the negatives, so it's probably my first serious photo of this lady with and they were, and you know, I was amazed at the beauty of the light, you know, especially when you develop and print yourself. You can control the beauty of the print by the use of contrast and brightness on the paper. And it had this lovely Rembrandt lighting that I could get with this lady by positioning her by the window. And she was really good, and I spent ages photographing her and her husband, getting these lovely character studies of her. And I remember thinking at the time that, you know, I can do it. I can take these photographs that I'd admired in magazines, and for some sort of, I'm not sure whether it was some sort of Salvation Army need to sort of be compassionate or something, but I found that photography was a way of illustrating that loneliness or aloneness of people, like Mrs. Richmond, because her husband died about that period, and I would go back and photograph her again, and she was obviously very lonely in her house, and I would show that by having big spaces and around her and an empty room, that sort of thing. And I was only about 14.
And influences, you know, I know, you know, you're a great fan of Cartier-Bresson.
Well, I think that everybody my age was influenced by the Family of Man. And the reason they were is because the Family of Man booklet, exhibition, was made into a booklet and somehow ended up in every library all around the world. And it was an amazing book because for the first time it showed photography as a truly creative tool, that people weren't taking just snapshots of families. People were talking with their cameras, were expressing, they were using light and shade as a painter would. They were telling little stories in just 2 or 3 images. And the family of man, there were the great names like Cartier-Bresson and Robert Frank, and I'm not sure if he was in it, but that period, André Cates, the Hungarian photographer, Robert Frank, the Swiss photographer. These people were fantastic. They were doing what I would love to have done at the time. And these guys and women, there was Dorothea Land, she was in the book, the woman that did the Appalachian series, I can't remember her name now, Margaret Burke White, it doesn't matter, men and women were making these fantastic images. My father was a great charcoal drawer, and he would do drawings of characters, of portraits of people, and they were very photographic. And he was obviously enjoyed that photographic thing, that stark black and white, because charcoal drawing is black and white. Well, they of me. They were a great family, and yeah. I mean, I got nothing but support, and I'm sure they helped me out financially with paper and chemicals and things, which were expensive then as it is now. But as you travel through your teenagehood, other things influence you, and I was getting into music as well. And I discovered, folk music. I particularly have always enjoyed that, English folk music, and Bob Dylan and people like that. And but photography's always been there with me. And I think that probably the first really serious work that I was doing was when I left Wellington and came to live in New Plymouth, and that was about 1970. I'd qualified as a draftsman, and I came to work in a company in New Plymouth. And I remember when I was driving to New Plymouth, I went through Wanganui, and I probably took one of the best photos I've ever taken in my life. The one of the tree, which has very feminine shaped lines to it. It's in the book, it's the second page, I think. And that was shot in about 1970 or 71. And I think I was making the best photographs I've ever made in my life during that period, because I was completely fresh to it. And I wasn't really influenced by all these great names. I'd become aware of them, but I'd hardly seen anything of their work, only really in the family of man, that sort of thing. And I'd realised that Time Life magazine was really another kind of photography that I wasn't really interested in. That was more almost journalistic, illustrative work. That the true communicators were people like Bresson.
It seems to me that some of your most enduring images, in my view, have been pictures of people and people in situations, and it seems to me you've got this uncanny knack of capturing that. How do you approach that? Why? What do you think? And they're often humorous photos.
Well, my knack of photographing people, as you put it, uncanny knack, is I've always made people part of the landscape. I've always been interested in vertical things, that stark vertical things, like trees and like people, and the way that they form shapes in the landscape. And it becomes almost as important as the facial expressions of the people, is how they fit together and how they fit. And it's really photographing people in the landscape is really like just extending the landscape. And even now, 40-something years later, I still do that. I make people part of the landscape in the shapes of their faces and the way they fit. And I've never been that interested in telling stories with my camera. I've never been that interested in documentary. I've never gone and done stories, and that's why I've probably never been a true professional. I'm very much a singular image person, and my hero, like Bresson and Cates and people like that, they're the same. They travel, and they find things, and they make little paintings or photographs of those things, and then they move on. They don't linger and tell stories.
And yet you'd also have a great admiration, I suspect, for somebody like Salgado, who's quite the opposite, isn't he? He'll make a book on photographs, which I guess is a different kind of discipline.
Well, Salgado is a much different photographer to me, in that he does attempt to tell stories. He'll go to the mines in Brazil and spend hours photographing the ladder, the people that climb ladders, and get these incredible patterns of their bodies. And he's really trying to help the plight of those people by exposing a form of slavery in that case. So he is a storyteller, and some of his great epic books, like Terra Nova, the people of the land, the huge book that he's just finished on Africa, and the desert people, they're really storybooks.
Okay. The other thing that I notice with your photos is, as often as not, particularly perhaps photos from perhaps 5 years and back, they have a great deal of whimsy and humour. And again, one of the photos that immediately springs to mind is the photograph of the man trying to get the carpet into his larder vehicle. Now, tell me about that photo.
The irony of life is humour, and everywhere around you, funny things are happening. And yes, I've always been able to capture that. I've always charged in when something funny is happening or something silly is happening, and I'll almost race across a field to get it. And in the photograph that's in my second book, Just a Word, of somebody in a Russian hat trying to stuff a giant Turkish carpet into a larder, and it won't go in. He's trying to bend it and double and everything, and it was so silly. Yep. But all the elements that came together, and in my case, it's a matter of finding that and photographing, but at the same time trying to make the photograph artistically balanced, and all the decisive moments and shapes and everything sit comfortably. There's so many different things going on in a photograph. There's mass, there's light and shade, there's shape, there's form, there's the way things fit into the landscape, like I mentioned before, and then there's the famous Cartier-Bresson term, the decisive moment, the moment when all these things happen, and being able to see it and press the button at that moment.
Another shot that is one of my favourites was a shot you took in Waitara in North Taranaki several years ago now, outside a fish and chip shop. It's just a beautifully shaped photograph. It's a little bit of a Diane Arbus, and tell me about that photo anyway. I mean, it's a great image. How did that come about?
It was shortly after the freezing works closed in Waitara, and there was, I assume, a lot of unemployment. And it's an interesting photo because the mother of the three children is the tower of strength in the photograph, and she's virtually holding the three children up, and the husband is leaning on her, and it's one of those photos where all the elements come right. Everything is just absolutely magical. The time, the period, what the photograph is saying, the courage of the photographer to approach these people and to take the photo and to be able to give it time to concentrate on the composition and everything. It's absolutely magical. Now, I don't take photos like that anymore. I don't like approaching people anymore.
Why? Can I just? Why is that?
I find people's attitude towards strangers coming up to them with a camera, especially when there's children involved. It's an attitude that comes out of what seems to be the modern what-if society, the modern fear society. So maybe it's as much to do with me getting old and softening up, as you put it earlier. But I find approaching people, total strangers, family groups, or trying to photograph their children is much more difficult these days because people want to know why. the funny thing is that often these people will go off down to the bookshop and gaze at the milk books and magazines that are full of candid photography, and say, "Oh wow, woo wooey," and all that. But when somebody approaches them for doing the same thing, in effect, they're ultra suspicious. Now I can clearly remember, like in my gala day period, and shooting gala days in New Plymouth and street scenes and the Auckland street photos and that, people would just ignore somebody with a camera, and you'd often be just written off as a nutter, which is great. But now they're not, and they'll cross a football field to see what you're doing. And we often talk about this, you know, and as I get older, I just want less aggression in my life, and I find other ways to take these photos. I still take them. I was shooting photos yesterday in Waitara of people on a kindergarten of all places, a big celebration with singing and dancing going on. I just walked on, but I do it in a totally different way now.
In my view, you've never ever got the recognition for the body of work that you've produced over the last 30 or 40 years. Have you got any comment on that?
Well, it's because I think a lot of it's to do with the personality of the photographer and how they push themselves and how they make themselves available. It's probably got more to do with that than the quality of the work they put out. I know many fine photographers that are very deserving of grants and recognition, but don't get it because they just quietly get on with it on their own in the background, and they don't and may not search for it. I'm happy with the way I am. I'm not unhappy. It would probably be nice to have been recognised a bit more by the gallery scene, or the public galleries, but it's just the way it is. My work is quite old-fashioned looking. I don't follow trends, where trends are with huge colour prints of small detail and blown up, and then the trend may go another way. I don't, double images, things like that. I certainly don't follow those trends. In fact, my style has been the same ever since I started. I've used the same camera, I've used the same film, I've used the same processing. Right from the very beginning, I found a system that worked, and it communicates perfectly for me, and I've seen no reason to change it.
Together amongst your other body of work, 3 books that you've self-published, I think. Just a Word, Wellingtonia, of course, the recent one, and
Face Value.
Face Value. Face Value was the first one,
yeah.
I think. Tell us a little bit about.
Well, Face Value was the first book I did in '93, and it was really, as the book describes, a collection of 20 years of work. So it went from '73 to '93, and it was really my favourite work of that period. While the photos linked with each other, they were still singular images, as I mentioned before, and they just celebrated, in my mind, the joy of image making. And at that time I was doing a lot of in-your-face portraiture, and there's a lot of that portraiture in the book. But there's also quite a bit of balanced, decisive moment stuff and humorous stuff, which of course is the other 2 big drivers. The second book, Just a Word, was published only 3 years later, and it was published cooperatively with a publishing company, SBI, which I created. So basically it was self-published, but it was done that way to make it look like it wasn't self-published, which at the time was important. But I now realise that self-publishing is one of the most noble things you can do with books. But anyway, that's another issue. Just a Word, the title came from a photograph in the book of the perfectly balanced group of children jumping off a wharf. And the sign on the wharf, the public sign, was saying, just a word before you jump, or before you launch, and it was a boatie safety thing. So it was became the title of the book. But just a word is mainly made up of actually landscapes, of the wet light landscapes, of macro landscapes, and with the scatterings of balance. There's no portraits in the whole book. I think there might be one. And it was all about balancing of objects, and that's what that book's about. Then the third book I did was published by Photoforum in Auckland as one of their annual books, and it was, well, technically it was co-published, but it was a major exhibition I had in the museum at Wellington, Museum of City and Sea, and the name Wellingtonia came from the museum. They thought it up as a word that was similar to the Wellingtonian, and Wellingtonia as a doing word. And the book is just about Wellington, and it's a collection of work about Wellington, and it's all quirky and funny, and it's all people flying through the air, children doing silly things, three-legged dogs balancing on rocks on the beach. It's just quirky stuff from around Wellington. And I'm planning a fourth book, which I'm hoping to call Patia Ready and Other New Zealand Landscapes, and it's really just a collection of landscapes from all over New Zealand, and so I'd love to get that book out as well.
And obviously Patia Ready has some reference to the township of Patia.
Well, there was a great sign as you drove through Patia of the Patia Ready Mix Concrete Company, but the word mix and concrete company had fallen off the sign. So, and Patia at the time had its freezing works had also closed, and if anything wasn't ready for anything, it was Patia, and yet people travelling through had this big sign saying Patia Ready, and it was only like that for a fairly short time before they fixed the sign up. So I think hopefully I'm the only one with that photograph, but I saw it straight away, and it's a lovely landscape, and so yeah, and I just thought it was a title that's a real Kiwi title. I've been quite fortunate, especially in recent years, to sell work through a couple of galleries, McNamara Gallery in Wanganui, Tinakori Gallery in Wellington, and Photospace. So I have started selling work, well, in recent years. So, you know, the books are like a mobile exhibition or catalogue of your work, and it would be nice to sell more. But I don't shoot photographs, or I don't take photographs to sell necessarily. I take them because of that drive.
And the next book that you hope to publish, Patia Ready, that'll be a collection of images that you've shot over the year, or are you still working on them, or have you got the photo images in your mind?
I've got most of the work that I need for Patia Ready. I'm not sure that is going to be the title yet. It's just an idea.
Yeah.
Some people would say I'm stupid to get a title like that, because who's going to pick it up in a bookshop with that title like that? But I quite like that thing about titles. That I mean, it'd be so easy just to write New Zealand landscapes to get more people to pick it up. But it's I like something that's got a sort of a sense of irony about it.
How do you think photography stands in New Zealand these days in terms of recognised as an art form, the way it's handled, the way galleries treat photographers? Do you...
Probably the only way to answer the question of where photography fits in the world is to try to imagine 50 years' time what in the world will exist in the way of New Zealand photography, and probably only about 3 images will stand the test of time, and one would probably be The Monsoon Girl by Brian Brake. Perhaps one of Anne Zwestra. Anne Zwestra's works may survive, and that's probably all. Maybe only 2 pictures in the whole world. Maybe the other Brian Brake one of Picasso, where the child had a finger in his mouth. And it's interesting because the great New Zealand photographers are not Brian Brake, in my mind. I mean, he's great, but the people that are doing the work now that are, in my mind, are really shifting the sands, don't get any recognition at all. are virtually unknown. The great photographers in New Zealand are unknown.
And yet there seems to be a preference by galleries to, support the works of, let's say, Anne Noble, Lawrence Aberhart, to a lesser extent Fiona Clark. It seems to be a fairly tight little community, and it's...
Well, there's an old boys network in all art forms, in almost all things, and gallery directors often look for the easy out. So if they want to do an exhibition of New Zealand photographers, the same group of names come up. And I'm not going to say the names, but the same group, and in some cases some of those people haven't done anything for the last 20 years, but their same names come up. Now I think it's because there's nobody doing any serious research, there's no curators out there with any brain cells left to actually look around to what's going on, especially with some of the new younger photographers. There's nobody around looking, there's nobody dredging through the thousands of photographers looking for people that are really stretching the medium. They can pick on the same names and get us safe, and those names like Peter Perrier, Lawrence Aberhart and co, while their work is interesting and is great in its own right and certainly sells, there are lots of people in my mind doing a work that's every bit as good, if not better.
Somebody the other day, a well-known commercial photographer in New Zealand, said, I know exactly the photograph I want before I even go to the job. I know the lens I'm going to use, I know the background. India coming up, how are you going to approach that? What are you hoping to get out of India?
Well, that would be so boring to know the image you're going to get before you leave. The excitement of going to somewhere like India is the whole new landscape, everything that's different. Now, what I don't want to do in India is is just do what people would expect you to do, to make portraits of beautiful Indian girls and lovely coloured saris, or old people with their elephants and camels and things like that. But I just want to see how it affects me. Now I've been to other places before, and and where it's taken me a long time to come to terms with it. I was in China a few years ago, and I found the landscape to be the most beautiful part of China. And I spent hours and hours taking photos from train windows because there was no other way of getting into the landscape, and it was incredibly beautiful, and I got some really nice pictures. But I also got great street scenes and pictures of people, but they're not dissimilar to the view of China that you saw from the great travelling photographers. And one of the things I like doing is getting a sense of place for a place. That's the reason I like coming up here to New Plymouth, because there's a lovely light here and I know this area well. So going to somewhere strange like India, it'll take a while. So what we're going to do is we're going to base ourselves in certain areas for days at a time, or maybe a week, just to get a feel for it. And then if things work, then I'll start shooting photos, and I hope I will, and I hope I come back with something that I'm not expecting to come back with.
Another favourite area of yours is the west coast of the South Island, Blackball. You've taken some wonderful landscapes down there. That's obviously a favourite spot.
I love the west coast because I like the wet, murky light of New Zealand. It's the most beautiful light. I like the way the greyness of the grass. I like the way trees stand out on the landscape. I like the rustic buildings. I like the feeling of age of the place. I know it's not old as in historical, but there's a kind of decay about the environment and the landscape that you don't see anywhere else. And as I said earlier, it's very annoying to go to somewhere like the West Coast and it's bright and sunny, because it's just not what the West Coast is about. And the little town that you mentioned, Blackball, I just discovered that. Other photographers have been there and photographed there, but I just discovered it because it's so rustic and interesting. And if you were looking for somewhere that represented New Zealand of the 1950s, that's the place. And so I've always loved going there. Yeah.
Some photographers have to live with images for a while before they grow on them or whatever. Do you just grow up upon you, or?
Well, I respond immediately, obviously, to the scene, and then I'll fall in love with pictures as I look at them, and I might put them on my blog site and my website. But as I say on the blog site, I'm lucky to get 2 good pictures a year. Right now, I've isolated 7 out for this year, and that'll get cut down to 2 or 3. For example, this year I think 2 of the good images that I've got is the legs in the surf, which you know, and the one-legged tap dancer in Wellington. And in both those cases I hunted for those photos, and I worked on them over a matter of weeks.
Tell us a little more about let's say the tap dancer. You know, the image. Well, it's a clever image in my view.
Well, there's a young boy, he's probably about 12 or 13, who's a very good tap dancer, and he wants to go and study overseas or attend a concert or something. And so he busks in Cuba Mall, and Cuba Mall is where I live. I live on Cuba Street, right in the centre of Wellington. So it's my front yard, and I'd seen him there. Now he's very hard to photograph, mainly because he's moving flat out. There's always a ring of people around him. And while all of that is interesting, blurring the legs and the ring of people, I wanted something else. I mean, that would be dead easy to shoot. And I found one angle after watching him for about a month, and I was scared that he was going to vanish. And I found one angle and one position where he balanced with where he sets up his board that he dances on to get the tapping noise. And I noticed that he throws one leg up incredibly high and it vanishes. And so you get if you shoot from the back, it looks like he's one-legged. And the position I've got of him on a toe, balanced with the rubbish bin support that's next to him, and it all just balances perfectly. And I saw that days ahead, and I had to wait for the light to be right, and then I crept in behind and shot the photo. And magically I got it, bang on, and I was on such a high when I got that. And the other good image this year, I think, is the Lyle Bay. I was watching the surfers. Now I don't use telephoto lenses, I just use a prime lens. It's about 40mm equivalent. And so I wasn't able to get very close, but it wasn't important. And one magical moment, these surfers had gone under the wave with one leg each sticking out of the water. And it's so quirky and weird. And I love photos like that.
And ultimately, what would you like to happen to, if anything, to the body of work that you've now been working on for probably the best part of 45 years?
Well, I'd like to keep editing it. I'd like to edit out the best work that I think, and certainly the work from the books. And I'd like it somewhere to deposit it, perhaps in the Turnbull Library or somewhere like that. But I'd like to keep working. I'm not sure who said it, but photographers make a sense of the mess. And when you look out at the world, it's a big mess. And photographers isolate little pieces of that mess and they make sense of it. And I think that's a really good description, making sense of the mess. It would actually be a good title for a book. And I know all artists do it to an extent, all visual artists do. But I think that you see, photography is one of the only art form where you start with a finished image. You don't start with a blank canvas. You actually start with a big mess out there. So our job is to make sense of that mess, is to find little parts of it and to isolate it, whether they're moving subjects or still subjects. Whereas a painter creates a mess on the canvas, so they work the opposite way. So it's quite unique to photography. I also believe that photography, of all the visual art forms, is probably one of the hardest ones to actually achieve in, because there's so many photographers out there, and there's so many doing a bad job of it, that it's hard to actually swim through that mess to make your work seen. And that's why it's a very difficult art form to actually achieve recognition in, almost compared to all other arts. It's pretty obvious fairly quickly with a painter whether they're good or not. But to actually get your work seen, for somebody to decide that with photography is the difficulty as well.